So last week I did this whole thing about MMORPG questing in various games, what I thought the best kinds of questing was. You can watch that video. And in that video, I called Final Fantasy XIV the king of context, because I think that by far it's got some of the best narrative and world building in any MMORPG in the modern era. Well, Final Fantasy XIV and Star Wars The Old Republic, but they basically do things entirely the same. Up until the new expansion, which I believe is technically called Knights of the Stolen Telltale Ideas. While I think Final Fantasy XIV does this better than Star Wars does, I still think Star Wars is a really good narrative game, but I'm going to focus in on Final Fantasy XIV in this video because Stormblood just got announced and I'd like to make some demands of Square, who will never see this video. Also, Square, if you do happen to see this, get back to work on a Final Fantasy XV PC release. But what sets these two games apart from other MMORPGs? I mean, all of these games have questing in some form or another. What makes these two really different? These two games focus more so than any other MMORPG on the narrative and context of their worlds. Also, the Secret World does this, but it does this in a different way that is like super friggin' cool, but I'm not going to get into right now. Both of these games hinge a lot of their gameplay on the main scenario quest, or maybe the main story quest, or the class quest, or whatever the hell you want to call it. There's a lot of names for it. It's just the main quest. So what is this weird concept? Well, you've probably played a game with a main story quest in it. That's that single line that draws you through the entire game, whether it's a completely linear experience like Final Fantasy XIII was, and sorry for bringing that up. Or the main through line of a more open adventure, something that draws you along a specific path through a larger, more explorable world. In this case, it falls more into the latter, because there's a lot more things to do in these games than just, hit enemies with swords and talk about how much hope is such a little bitch. You are just insufferable! Other MMORPGs have narratives, that's absolutely true, and a lot of them have really good narratives. I mean, as I said, the Secret World is fantastic, the Elder Scrolls Online is amazing for this. Even the new World of Warcraft expansion is finally actually doing a story that doesn't suck dick. But none of them handle it in quite the same way, in taking that central through-line narrative structure and turning it into a game mechanic unto itself. This is what I like to define as the main story quest. A simple through-line, a guiding hand, which not only draws players through the narrative of the world, but through its mechanics as well. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this style of questing, this style of narrative exploration in MMORPGs, and talk about what makes it great and what makes it not so great, so that hopefully Stormblood, the new Final Fantasy expansion, and also Knights of the Eternal Throne, that new Star Wars expansion, then again, I haven't really played that, can do this even better than it does now. So if you've ever played Final Fantasy XIV in your life, you will know what the main story quest is, or at least you'll have tasted it. Fresh off the boat and or hover carriage, you're given this main story quest. The same thing happens with Star Wars The Old Republic. As soon as you log into the game, the first thing you interact with outside of character creation is your class quest. These begin you on your way. They set a very early precedent. This is your guiding hand. Follow these quests and they will take you where you need to go, when you need to go there. And the big thing that sets it apart from other MMORPGs is this guiding hand stays with you for your entire experience. From the very beginning, when you're killing your first squirrel thing, all the way up to doing your first dungeons, all the way up to max level where you're stepping into your first raids, this quest is always with you. Unless you exhaust it, and then it comes right back to you in the next patch. Now, a lot of MMORPGs have quest chains that act like and simulate the main story quest, and actually act as the main story quest for a region, maybe even for an entire continent. And that's awesome. There's a lot of cool stuff that can be done with this, but when you actually intone that narrative as the spine of the entire experience, from 1 to raiding, to endgame, to max level, to whatever, you really can change how this stuff can be written. You see this a lot in Final Fantasy XIV. Because everybody knows that there's this core narrative that everybody's doing, side questing hubs can riff off this core narrative. If you're dealing with the primals or beast tribes and have dealt with them in the past, you can come back to those story beats and you'll know that the player has accomplished them. Unlike World of Warcraft, where you can't necessarily come back to the story beat of the Defias Brotherhood because you can't guarantee that everybody did Westfall. Well, that's not actually fully true. You can come back to these story beats, but they feel a lot less relevant. And you can't really shove them into a really headlining central position if nobody did the intro quests. That's what makes this sort of narrative spine so powerful. You know what the narrative of every player is gonna be, and you can write the world around that. And that gives the world a lot more context. This can also kind of denote your narrative a sense of time, because you know the linear order in which events happen, and you can illustrate those events directly, as opposed to giving sort of this hazy idea of, yeah, I guess this happened. A good example from Final Fantasy XIV, and I'm going to do my best not to spoil anything, but there might be some minor spoilers, you might be able to intone some things, so I'm sorry in advance. An order in the game is massacred by the villain faction of the Garlean Empire, and this causes the player character to have to return to a zone they'd previously been. Despite the fact that the player has leveled through this area before and completed quests in this area before, you're now back and experiencing a new set of quests. The main quest brings you through here, but all of the side quests also go into this narrative. Whereas before you were looking for someone in the main quest and all of the quests around that seemed like helping people so that you could help find this person, now the main quest is about trying to deal with the fact that this order has been massacred. And a lot of the side quests relate to funerary rites and mourning. And it changes the feel of the zone, despite the fact that you've been here before. It's a creative touch. Because of the change in tone of the main story quest, it informed the other quests around it, which changed their tone. And now you have a totally different experience in this region. And that's really friggin' cool! This main quest structure can also inform a lot of gameplay decisions. A good example of this is Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of zones with very bizarre level stratifications in them. An area with level 15 enemies may suddenly give way to an area with level 45 enemies. This is very true in one zone, where if you pass through one gate without thinking, you're immediately fighting things 30 levels higher than you. This is true in almost every zone in the game. Not necessarily to the extent of 30 levels, but almost every zone in Final Fantasy XIV has a level stratification that is a little bit off kilter. It means that the zones are not set into a certain range of levels, say from level 1 to 10, level 10 to 15, so on. They in fact just have bizarre levels. There might be areas with level 8 enemies, a few meters away from areas with level 25 enemies. This is true of the whole game, and otherwise it would be incredibly confusing to keep track of. You'd have to divide it into different subzones, and maybe find a way to define them. But because Final Fantasy XIV has this narrative spine that the player is following throughout their experience, the player can be guided safely through these zones without them being confusing, surprisingly enough. It allows the zones to be a little bit more interesting because they feel like real places where there might be more dangerous monsters just around the corner and you can explore and walk into them. And it also makes questing more interesting because now you're making callbacks to these zones where you might encounter the same characters or interesting stories or evolutions of stories you've already completed. But because Final Fantasy XIV has this narrative spine that the player is following throughout their experience, the player can be guided safely through these zones without them being confusing, surprisingly enough. It allows the zones to be a little bit more interesting because they feel like real places where there might be more dangerous monsters just around the corner and you can explore and walk into them. And it also makes questing more interesting because now you're making callbacks to these zones where you might encounter the same characters or interesting stories or evolutions of stories you've already completed. Now, I've rambled for quite a few minutes on why this system is really good and why the unique system put down by Final Fantasy and Star Wars The Old Republic works really well. But now I'm going to argue why they need to tweak it a little bit, because it's got some problems as well. And this is where those Square developers who are not watching my video should listen up. Because despite being focused and contextual and really fulfilling, this system has also got some problems. Like agency, the ability to choose what to do, and also some serious cock blockage. Because this system can double as one of the most stringent and painful attunements of all time. At least it is for Final Fantasy XIV. Does, the Old Republic even have an endgame anymore? Or, do they just wait for the next episode to come out? I don't know. First of all, my problems with agency. Final Fantasy XIV's questing system is incredibly intense, but it is also incredibly restrictive. You are forced into essentially a singular path through the entire game. There are some points where you can branch out and do side questing hubs, but generally these only unlock after specific main quests. In fact, much of the game's actual content outside of that main quest is still bound up in an unlocking process that is tied to the main quest. A really good example of this is dungeons. Even if you are of a high enough level or above to access dungeons, which you don't unlock in the main story quest until around level 15, you can't do those dungeons because you haven't completed the main story quest for them. This goes to the extreme in a probably far rarer case where the entire end game is locked behind this main story quest. Right now, I have a level 60 white mage, but I cannot raid in Heavensward because I have not completed the main story quest. I have almost completed the main story quest. I'm in like the last 20, and I'll probably be done it by the time this video goes up. But at the moment, I can't do Alexander, despite the fact that I am level 60 and meet every other requirement to begin the process of gearing to him. But I can't, because I haven't gone through the story yet. Some people might think, yeah, this makes sense. You have to finish the story before you can do your endgame rating. You have to eat your peas before you can have your pudding. But also, some people would say, what the shit? I meet every other requirement. Why do I have to do this arbitrary story quest for something that is, at this point, kind of tangentially related to that arbitrary story quest? It can be kind of painful, and I know I have been frustrated by it because I really want to do Alexander. This leads the main story quest to feeling kind of like an attunement. You know, those things in WildStar that we hated. And when you think about all the stuff that's locked behind this attunement, dungeons, raids, trials, everything you can really think of in Final Fantasy, you can sort of understand why I see it as one of the most long and convoluted attunements in MMORPGs. But one other thing, and it ties into the intense focus that Final Fantasy XIV has on its main story, is that it suffers from linearity. Despite it being one of the most content-flush MMORPGs out there, Final Fantasy XIV suffers from extreme linearity during its leveling process. You really don't have a choice of where you go. You follow the main quest, or you don't level. You can still gain experience through other ways. You can do leave quests, or you can do dungeons, or you can do guild hests. There's a lot of sources of progression, but because all of the rewards for that progression, things like endgame and new dungeons and new trials, new raids, are all locked behind the main story quest, you wind up having to follow the linear path regardless. And these are the trade-offs you get when it comes to creating a system so heavily based on context. You're gonna have to sacrifice quite a few things to focus that story in, and Final Fantasy XIV seems content to sacrifice them, and we seem content to play a game that makes those sacrifices, because despite all of that, despite the fact that it feels like a convoluted attunement, and that it's incredibly linear, it's still also fantastic. Never have I really been more motivated to complete quests in an MMORPG as I have been in Final Fantasy XIV, and I'm not a huge fan of questing. I'm more of a five-man content guy. But the way the narrative is portrayed, the way this questing is structured, the way you have to progress through the game, it all draws you in to this sense of being in a world. It takes that amazing openness and depth of MMORPGs and refines it in a different way. One that's far more linear, that lacks a lot of the agency we're used to in MMORPGs, but one that still manages to create a living and breathing world. One focused on its characters and its events instead of its vast and unexplored tracts of pretty much empty land filled with monsters. By any stretch of the imagination, it's not perfect. Some people might find it a little bit too slow. Some people might find it a little bit too linear. Some people might say it takes way too long to get into the stuff they actually want to do. Then again, it could be a lot worse. Could be Final Fantasy XIII. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video on Final Fantasy XIV's main story quest, what I think about it, and how I think they can make it better. I've been doing a lot of videos on Legion lately, so I thought I'd, decide to do something a little different for once, like a different game. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's really fun to make. As usual, I love these videos, so if you want to support the channel, please do like or subscribe. It's a huge boost as well. But thank you so much for watching, and you all have a great one.